Alright, hello everybody, Friendly Red here, and welcome to Red's Review. As you may surmise from the title, these videos will be about reviewing games that I've completed and want to give my overall thoughts on. Before we get into it though, I do want to give a few disclaimers. Unlike a lot of modern day reviews, I won't be giving any sort of numerical score or star ratings, percentages, anything like that. I want to use these videos to discuss what I liked about a game, what I might not have liked, and if I would recommend buying or playing the game yourself. I also won't discuss spoilers or specific late game content, as I don't want to ruin any surprises or secrets. Sound good? Great. Then, without further delay, let's get into the first ever Red's Review. Today's game of discussion is none other than Dragon's Dogma 2. So, where do we begin? I suppose I should start by briefly going over what Dragon's Dogma 2, which I will refer to as DD2 from here on, is, and from there we can move into more detailed discussion on the likes and dislikes I have with the game. Much like the original, DD2 is an open-world action RPG where you take on the role of the Arisen, a chosen hero who must save the world and yourself from the infamous dragon. Ever since that original game in 2012, we've seen the open-world genre of video games explode in popularity and mainstream appeal. It almost seems like every big game these days is going open-world, and I understand that it can become a bit tiring to some, especially if you play or have played multiple open world games within close proximity to each other. But, luckily, DD2 isn't like a lot of its contemporaries. So, the world of DD2. It's a fairly sizable map to explore, with lots of different paths, points of interest, towns, camps, caves, and the like to discover. I know, nothing too mind-blowing when thinking of an open-world game, but what makes DD2 stand out, at least to me, is how you interact and move within this world. See, a lot of modern open-world titles have huge maps with like dozens of icons, fast travel locations, markers, and all that, and they usually have different ways you can get around that world, be it on foot or using some sort of mount or vehicle system. DD2, in comparison, feels a lot more grounded. Don't get me wrong, there are still the typical open world fare, like icons scattered throughout the map and all that, but for the most part, you have to make your way through this world on your own 2 feet. There's not a whole lot of options for faster movement, and while there is still fast travel in the game, it's fairly limited in where you can travel to, and is also tied to an item that is pretty limited. This may be a deal breaker for some, but I honestly find that it greatly improves on the sense of adventure and fantasy that the game really wants you to feel every time you depart out into the world. It makes it so that you can really get to know the world around you as you go to and from different towns or points of interest. Of course, traveling around in the world also means you get to participate in what I think is the game's greatest strength, the combat. Combat in DD2 is honestly some of the best in the open world genre, and as I said, the best part about the game. As you explore the open world, you'll come across numerous different foes to fight, including goblins, harpies, lizard men-like beasts known as saurians, and much more. In addition to the smaller fodder, you can also come across larger boss-like opponents like ogres, cyclops, griffins, and yes, even dragons. Combat feels great regardless of what foe you're facing, but it really does shine against the larger beasts as you get more time to fight and use all your abilities. You can also climb on the larger enemies and target weak points on their bodies, similar to something like Shadow of the Colossus. As in the original, you can select from a variety of different vocations or classes to best suit your playstyle. From ranged combat, melee combat, flinging spells, or some combo of both, there's a decent variety in playstyles, and as you continue to use a vocation, you gain even more skills and passives to really make it your own. That being said, I do have some suggestions as well as some criticisms regarding the vocations. While I think all the vocations are all good and fun to play, I personally find that the melee focused classes are the most fun and really make combat stand out the best, which thankfully most of the vocations in game are melee. Ranged vocations on the other hand feel a bit too slow and not really as engaging as the melee ones, so I would personally recommend playing a melee class and leaving the ranged options for your allies. Speaking of which, party members in games is certainly not a new concept or anything, but the way DD2 handles that concept with the pawn system is still one of the most unique and fun implementations of it. Pretty soon after making your character, which, yeah, I forgot to mention it, but the character creator in DD2 is amazing, you'll get introduced to pawns. Pawns act as your party members in DD2, and they will be who accompanies you in your journeys across the game. Like your character, the Arisen, you also get to make your own special pawn, that being your main pawn. Your main pawn is going to act as your main partner throughout the entire game, and you can customize their looks, vocation, equipment, and more, all like you can your main character. In addition, you can hire up to 2 or more pawns for your party for a max size of 4, and those higher hireable pods can be really special. As you play the game, you will come across objects known as riftstones, and at those you can examine pods made by other players and hire whichever ones you want. In addition, you can also come across wandering ponds as you explore the world, and like the ones found at riftstones, they can be ones made by other players. Combining the pond system with the game's fantastic character creator, you just have a treasure trove of possibilities as to who you get to undertake your journey through DD2 with, and much like the combat, it remains one of my favorite things about the game. So, there's clearly a lot I like about DD2, but it's not a perfect game, that's for sure. In regards to sore spots about it, I really only have two major ones I can think of that are worth mentioning. The first being, well, the story. For a game that touts itself as narrative driven on its store page, the story of DD2 is really bad and not at all worth paying attention to, in my opinion. Most story quests themselves are not really that fun gameplay wise, as they typically involve doing things in towns or just talking to different characters, most of whom you barely do anything with outside of those quests. None of them really play into the game's strength, the combat, and as a whole the story felt very disjointed and unconnected. Hell, the two characters on the game's key art are barely even featured in the game, having probably less than 20 minutes of screen time combined. Things just happen without any real explanation or reason, and I'll be honest, I kind of stopped caring pretty early in my playthrough, as I could tell it really wasn't going to be anything that great. Honestly, the only thing you need to remember about the story is that you're the Arisen, and you need to stop the big bad evil dragon. Everything else aside from that can basically be ignored. Thankfully, there aren't a ton of major unlocks or anything like that tied to the story, as I can recall, so you can largely ignore it if you want and just explore the world and make your own fun, which I would recommend doing, rather than just rushing through the story quests. I did lots of that in my first playthrough, which is probably why it took me as long as it did to finish the game. The only other complaint I have with the game is in its technical performance, though my gripes with it aren't nearly as bad as they are with the story. It's been talked about a lot already, but yes, DD2 isn't exactly the most stable performing game in its current state. Thankfully, its performance woes really only flare up when you're in the big towns of the game, and not where it really matters, that being the combat and open world exploration. Yes, of course I would prefer the game to be running consistently smooth in all aspects and areas, but the majority of your game time in DD2 is in the open world, not towns. So while the bad performance in those towns is annoying, in the grand scheme of the game, it's actually not all too bad. Still, it's worth pointing out, and hopefully it'll be fixed in patches to come later down the line. One other sore spot I see talked about online is the enemy diversity, or lack thereof. Personally, I don't have an issue with the diversity, as I think there's enough with the current enemies in the game, but I do think the encounter rates of those enemies could use a slight bit of work. When you're exploring, and not even for a long time or a large distance, you come across a lot of enemy groups in a very short span of time, and I think this is the main reason this point pops up in discussions about the game. If the encounter rates were lowered just a bit, it would probably make for a bit more balanced out experience of travel, exploring, and fighting when traversing the world, and thus the feeling of not a lot of enemy diversity would be diminished, since it wouldn't be encountering those same enemies as much as before. So, those are my main likes and dislikes regarding DD2. But what do I think overall? Would I recommend the game? Well, if you like open world games but are too used to the convenience a lot of modern ones have, and do not like backtracking a lot in games, you should probably stay away. If you like deep, rich, and interesting stories with memorable characters and fun interactions, stay far, far away. But if you want a rich, detailed, and beautiful fantasy world to discover, one with a real sense of adventure and immensely satisfying combat, one that you can explore with essentially anyone you can think of or make yourself, well, I think DD2 is the game for you. I think the best way to enjoy DD2 is to just go out, explore, make your own fun and adventures. Just going through the world and enjoying the sights, discoveries, and of course combat is where the game really shines. Also, shout out to nighttime in this game, as it's one of the few games I can think of where night actually feels like night, being properly dark and appropriately moody, mostly due to the lack of artificial lights within the game world itself. Night in the game also hosts some of the more formidable and tricky foes, so you really need to prepare yourself for travel and combat if you decide to go out at night. With all that being said, I do indeed recommend Dragon's Dogma 2. It may not be perfect, but it's easily one of the most fun games I've played so far this year. Even after 40 hours on my first run, I'm eager to get back in and continue on in New Game Plus, if that says anything. But I think that'll do it for this first ever Reds review. I hope I was able to inform you about the game and relay my thoughts on it. As always, I appreciate you watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.